Hello and welcome to Outlaw Bookseller. Today I want to talk about a writer who I first discovered a very long time ago in the early 1980s and who I've wanted to make a video about since I started the channel nearly 4 years ago, but I've never got around to it. But now just feels like the right time because I've recently gone back to his work to reread some of it, and it was work which I read an awful lot in the 80s and read again and again and again because it had a big impact on me. And he's not a science fiction writer, he's something quite different. Though in my mind, there isn't a great deal of difference between what this writer explores, a world which is unknown to many people, and what science fiction writers do. And I discovered him in the period of the early 80s, as I say, which is the time when I first became truly a serious science fiction writer. Alongside reading SF in that period, I was also reading a lot of classic counterculture writing, some of which was still relatively new at that point and still quite fresh. And as time has gone on, I think we've had less and less truly countercultural writing as the counterculture has changed the mainstream. So this writer was a big thing for me, and I discovered his work through rock music, and one of my favourite bands who I was very into at that time was The Doors. And this is The Doors' eponymous debut album, which a lot of you will know. And what The Doors did that nobody else had really done before was to bring literary references into rock music in a way that nobody had. And even though Dylan was quite literary, Lou Reed was quite a literary writer, it was Jim Morrison of The Doors, who was a very big reader and who referred directly to works of literature, particularly in this album. And there are references to Sophocles, Nietzsche, Celine, Bertolt Brecht and others. And this was recorded in 1966-67 and certainly came out in 67. I think it might be recorded late 66, I can't recall. And this was their first album, was a huge smash, of course. And in the very first song, the opening song, Break On Through to the Other Side, which was also their first single, the big hit, of course, was Light My Fire, which came a bit later on. There is a quotation from a book, and I didn't know that when I heard it, but when I read the first book I read about The Doors, which was a book called No One Here Gets Out Alive by Jerry Hopkins, who did done a biography of Elvis, and Danny Sugarman, who had known The Doors, and it was a huge bestseller. It was quite sensationalistic, and there was a part in it where Sugarman, who was very young when he met Morrison and very impressionable, Morrison gave him some books to read, and he lists the books, and he said that one book that he was given by Jim to read, which he said shocked him even years and years later that he gave it to him, and that book was City of Night by John Rechy. This is the current UK edition from Serpent's Tail and Serpent's Tail Classics, and this was reissued in 2021. And it's a real cult book. It was a very famous book in its time, but for many years now it's been like an underground sort of classic. And as I say, I discovered this in the early 80s. So I sought this book out, and I didn't think it was in print then. And I was working in a factory assembling car engines, and I just came across it. I just found a copy of it there, and somebody had been reading it, and I said, oh, do you mind if I have that, because I've always wanted to read that. And one of my fellow workers said, oh, you don't want to read that, it's all about gay men. And obviously those were different times, as they say. Things were not quite as understanding as they are now, even though even by then homosexuality had been legal in Britain for quite some time. So my original copy is long gone, wish I kept it, and I have to say it was an eye-opening book, and it was also a very brilliant one. And I saw Rechy as being very much in the tradition of the Beat generation. Even though he was younger than Kerouac and Cassidy and Ginsberg and Burroughs and Clennon Holmes, all those people. He came a bit later. It still had the tincture of the Beat generation, and the style of the book seemed very stream of consciousness, even though he put it together very, very carefully over multiple drafts. And it had that feeling of the counterculture. And it was published in 1963 by Grove Press, the classic underground American publisher. And Grove were really, really important. They published people like Henry Miller, and Henry Miller's early works had been banned in the States, published in France and various other countries. And Miller was, of course, American, and they didn't get published until about 1964. So when this was published, it was quite daring, and obviously he had to be circumspect in his language. But this really was a quasi-autobiographical novel about a young man of Mexican-American heritage who leaves home in Texas, and he travels to great American cities, to New York and Los Angeles particularly. He goes to other cities as well, and he becomes a male hustler, a male prostitute, and you're invited into the demi-monde, the underworld of homosexuality in America in the early 60s. And I was delighted to see it back in print because it's an amazing book. And what's great about this book is not the fact that it covers just that aspect, just those things. It's not just a great gay novel. It's a great underground novel per se. And anybody who's read things like Kerouac, Burroughs, Charles Bukowski really should read this, because this is a really important work. And he's a really interesting writer. I'll tell you a bit more about him before going on to the work in depth. Rechy was born in 1931. He's still alive, so he's 94, and he was Mexican-American. His father was of Scots descent, his mother Mexican. His mother had a very big impact on him. And he grew up in El Paso in Texas. And throughout his life, he worked as a writer, an educator, and also as a prostitute, as we'll come on to. So if you're of nervous disposition, switch off now. And this is his first book, as I say. He spent some time in the army. He spent some time in university doing creative writing. And he's a very interesting character, very, very intense. And he's got this wonderful, wonderful style. And City of Night shows the central character, the narrator, going through these cities and exploring the different aspects of the gay underworld, from the sort of leather sort of obsessed people to drag queens and all the different sort of spectrums that you'll find within gay sexuality. And the book was published piecemeal in different magazines, and it got published, little bits of it, in various magazines, which were luckily the sort of magazines a lot of the key avant-garde people were published in. There's quite a buzz about him before it was published, and in the end he managed to get a big manuscript together. Grove Press were interested. He got it back. He rewrote it almost entirely. And when it came out, it didn't have great reviews, but it was a massive, massive bestseller for years and years and years. This really was one of the most famous books of the 1960s. And as I say, Jim Morrison was a huge fan of it. And because a lot of it is set in LA, then Morrison naturally would have read it because he was a big reader. And in the song Break On Through to the Other Side, there's a line that goes, made the scene day to day, week to week, hour to hour, and that is from City of Night. There's also a reference in City of Night, of course, or a reference I should say in the Doors to this book, in their album LA Woman, which was their final album from 1971, which of course contains the eponymous title song LA Woman, which has the chorus line of City of Light. Are you a lucky little lady in the City of Light, or just another lost angel? City of Night. And of course, Los Angeles, the City of Angels, and John Rechy has this repetitive riff that pops up in many of his books in the 60s and 70s about people who are lost angels seeking redemption on the streets, often through sexuality, drugs, criminality, and outsider behaviour. This is a copy of City of Night which I bought in 1985 when it was still in print, and as you see, it's spine faded and it's a Granada, and this takes me back, and I got rid of the one I was given, which was in a bit of a state, and this is much greater cover with a classic sort of exploitive Granada look with the neon lights there, and that actually looks like Piccadilly Circus to me. But the idea, of course, of Times Square, of Pershing Square in Los Angeles, and these young men drifting around selling their bodies and what have you. And the book really is a set of vignettes. It's quite a chunky volume. Let's see, 350 odd pages, and you encounter all sorts of characters. There's Neil, who is a S&M obsessed costume wearing leather man. There's Lance, who is a former Hollywood star. Well, he's been like a chorus line guy and he's not quite become a star. Very, very handsome, but he's in recession. He's fading away. And then there's Pete, who is a young male hustler. And it very much covers that narrative. And it's from the very beginning that you get this thing with these young men who are selling their bodies that the idea is that they are straight, they're not homosexual, that they are, they don't do anything, they just let people worship them and take their money. And the spectre rises quickly in this of, you older men say you start that way, and before you know it, you're paying for it. So in a way, the book really reminds me a lot, when I first read it, of an album which I really liked at that point, still like a lot of people know, which is Lou Reed's Transformer from 1972, which of course is full of stories of low life, of transvestism, homosexuality, all sorts of decadence and stuff, some of the classic glam rock records. And the two things sort of went together, except of course this book has a kind of darkness, and not to say that Lou Reed wasn't dark, he had a lot of darkness, but that's one of his lighter records, and the darkness sort of came through in the work of the Doors, and you can see why Morrison particularly really liked it. James Baldwin was a big apologist for this, so was Christopher Isherwood. David Bowie was a big fan of it as well. And as I say, it had loads and loads of praise, even though there was some negative reviews as well. And it did really, really well throughout the 60s. It had something like 8 or 9 reprints in hardcover, got to number 3 in most of the bestseller lists, it topped 1 or 2 of them, and it was a really major book. So it kind of faded away after that. And Rechy then left it for 3 years before he produced something else. He got out of LA and he'd spent quite a lot of time there, and he was writing in the day, teaching occasionally. He taught at UCLA at one point. I think that might have been a bit later on. And he was sort of male hustling, as they used to call it, at night. So he kept that up. It was very much part of his thing. And it's very, very hard to sort of categorize where City falls. It's very much an opening book in his career. It's arguably his best book, but he developed in a quite interesting way after that, and I want to talk about that going through the rest of his books. So he produced a sequel then 4 years later in 1967 for Grove Press, and that's Numbers. This is a Grove Press Black Cat edition, which I bought from Compendium, the long gone alternative bookshop in Camden in London. I bought this in about 83, 84. I think it would have been. And Numbers is a sequel to City of Night, 4 years between them. And Rechy had moved back to Texas. And this is even more autobiographical. And those of you who like early 80s British synth pop will know Soft Cell. And Soft Cell, their third single, I think it was their fourth technically if you include the Mutant Moments EP, and was called Numbers and was loosely based on this book. But quite honestly, it pulls punches compared to this. Things had moved on by this point in terms of American obscenity laws. A lot more was sayable and doable. And the sexuality in this book was displayed and described in a lot more punchy sort of fashion, raw, uncompromising and audacious. And really, Rechy was never one for being a shrinking violet. He wouldn't sort of couch things in poetic terms, even though his writing is quite poetic in a strange sort of way. The descriptions of sexuality in these books, they are straight ahead, and they're in your face and they're inescapable, and this comes up in this. And again, this is an autobiographical novel, so it's the second of a diptych in a way. And our central character, Johnny Rio, who is a thinly disguised John Rechy, has been away from LA, and he's living in Arizona, and he drives back to LA, and he decides he's going to stay there for 10 days. And he's driving through the desert, and as he's driving through the desert, insects are splattering on his windscreen, and he starts to count them, and he gets to 4, and he decides, I'll be there 10 days, and in that 10 days I'm going to have erotic encounters with as many people as I can, hence Numbers. And it's a book which is very, very much about narcissism. And when he gets back there, he meets various people he used to know, some of whom we know he's a writer, some don't realise he's a writer. And there's one occasion where a guy he hooks up with says, oh, do you remember that guy, that Number who used to walk around? He wrote a book, and he doesn't realise that it's Rechy. And there's a kind of comedy to that. And Johnny Rio, he has encounters with men and women, but increasingly with men. And he has this thing about numbers. It's about narcissism. He's into bodybuilding. And of course, this is the 60s. So there's also rock and roll on the radio. So there's references in this to bands like the Trogs and Summer in the City. But I said John Sebastian did Summer in the City. I can't recall. Things like that. You get these countercultural references coming through. LA in the 60s, very sunny, obviously. And it's about his 10 days in that city, and it ends with a number. And of course, numbers also refers to a book of the Bible. And because Rechy was Mexican American, he's sort of raised a Catholic, so you get these flashes of Catholicism coming in, and it really is quite something. And it's a lot more stripped down and less poetic than City of Night. City of Night has a detachment about it, which is very, very beautiful, but at the same time it has sort of reckless abandon and willful involvement as well. So this was an interesting one for me after reading City of Night, to see how he was able to develop in a period he spent away from Los Angeles, away from the world of the City of Night, and how he was able to be a bit more blatant and direct in his speech. And it's still a really amazing book now. But it is very narcissistic, but it's an interesting thing because it gets you thinking about the body and perfection and what you want to achieve. And he learned that lesson pretty early on, that what makes a lot of people attractive to other people is their very inaccessibility. And that's something that comes across in this. And it sounds very, very floral and, how can I put it, self-centered, but it never comes across that way. He's a writer with great integrity, and I guess you could compare him to Jean Genet, you know, a bit like Genet, not as flowery and not as romantic, a little bit more of an existentialist, but it's wonderful, wonderful stuff. He went through a difficult period then when he started taking more drugs. He got busted. I'm not sure what he was busted for, probably for some sort of sexual activity. And he wrote this book, This Day's Death, which I searched for years and years and years. And this is sort of pre-ABE. And I finally got it, I think I finally got it in the mid to late 90s. And I was greatly disappointed by it. I'd already read something by him later on, which he said that he didn't like it very much. And in a way, this was a step towards more mainstream acceptance, arguably, because it was clearly based on his relationship with his mother. And the character in this has a mother who has dementia. Of course, we didn't call it then. This is 1969, I think. Is it 69? Yeah, 69. And a lot of the book is taken up with the main characters dealing with his mother's excesses as she grows increasingly more senile. Senility is the word we used there. And I didn't like it. It could be that I wasn't mature enough to take it, that it was too different from his other work. And perhaps I was put off by the fact that he himself said he didn't like it. But I'm going to go back to it and reread it because I really think I need to do that. There's another strand as well about a trial, a criminal trial, in which is a huge miscarriage of justice, which I remember very little about. But this was a kind of period in which he started to sort of fall fallow. And he did say at that point that he was almost destroyed by LSD. And I'll come on to that a bit later on because he wrote something very powerful about LSD, which I'll touch on in a few moments. Another book of his, which I searched for years, was this book, The Vampires. And it's not about vampires in the supernatural or science fictional sense. It's about a Caribbean island. Some rich people have a house there. They invite lots of people there into an orgiastic situation. And there's all sorts of psychodrama going on. And this reminded me in a way of the kind of lush decadence that Anne Rice would indulge in. And this is where his writing showed the flashes forward of what would actually undermine him as a writer. There is something about gay writing, and I don't want this to sound homophobic, where to a certain extent it mirrors that thing that he is told in City of Night about how as you get older, somebody who thinks they're straight, who is, you know, playing around on the edges of the homosexual world, becomes more homosexual. And there's a kind of breathless, gosh, wow thing which comes into this, a kind of camp, I guess would be the word. And this suffuses this, even though this is quite a dark book, and it never really took off for me. And funnily enough, this was bought for me by a friend of mine, a friend called John, funnily enough, who is straight as well, and he lives in the States these days. And he was reading Rechy alongside me, and we used to discuss the books and found them absolutely fascinating. But that was another weak one. However, Rechy stepped up then. He produced a book which I consider to be one of his masterpieces, and it's a book that I've read and reread. And this for me is one of the great counterculture novels. It's a late one because it was published in 1972 by Viking. There was a UK Panther edition, And this is The Fourth Angel. As you see, this is a very beautiful garish trade paperback from Seaver Books, distributed by Grove Press. It's an imprint of Grove Press. And I bought this in 1985. I remember very, very vividly, this is an 83 reprint, getting this was coming into the shop I worked in, I'd ordered it in, and I was so excited to read it. I can remember unpacking it, standing at the counter thinking, gosh, I'm going to buy this today, I'm going to read this tonight. It's quite a slender novel. And The Fourth Angel is, with a very mysterious title, is an amazing counterculture book. And basically it's about 4 young people. There's a guy called Shell. There's a girl called Shelley Michelle, who's from quite rich background. She's about 16, 17. And there's Cobb and Manny, 2 guys. And they sort of running around LA late at night. They're drinking, they're taking drugs, they're experimenting sexually. And they are testing each other's boundaries by setting dares and doing different things. And they meet this guy called Jerry, who becomes their 4th angel. And Jerry has just lost a member of his family, has died, and he's feeling very disenfranchised. And they take him under their angelic wings, and they initiate him into the cruelty and bliss of their experimentation, which involves other people as well. And it's a very powerful, uncompromising book. The writing is very, very sharp, and the emotions are boiling on the surface. And of course, because this is the sort of coming to the sort of period of the counterculture where it spills over into the 70s, this is after Altamont, after Woodstock, the Vietnam War still going on, it's still LA, and it really is quite powerful. And there's a wonderful, wonderful part where they take some LSD and they go into like a mini mart, a small supermarket, and the descriptions of the LSD trip are amongst the most realistic and impressive writing about altered states of consciousness and drugs I've ever read. And back in the day, back in the early 80s, I read all the classic counterculture books, all the ones that deal with this matter. And it really is quite spectacularly good. So as a youth exploitation novel that is actually literature, it's utterly, utterly fantastic. And I would say if you can pick up one of Rechy's books, it's one of the least gay ones as well. It's one of the ones that deals with that issue less than others, though that does come up in the book a few times. And it's really about people projecting a hard surface to protect themselves from their hidden emotions. And that's a big theme in Rechy. That's through all his writing, and I think he did that himself, and you see that in Johnny Rio and the other analogues for Rechy himself in the earlier books. It is a mixture of brittle tenderness, of savagery, of cruelty and compassion. You know, all of human life is in these books, and he holds nothing back. They're very emotive works, and sometimes they're a bit too emotive, but you've got to admire his strength and his willingness to put these young people on the line. And it's about confronting reality and people asking the question of, what do I really want to do with my life? What do I really want to be? I don't want to fade away. I want to grasp things by the scruff of the neck. And it's really brave stuff. And I smile thinking about it, because even though there's some very dark stuff in this book, there's some brilliant stuff as well. So this is one I would urge you to pick up if you can. I would recommend all his work up to a certain point, with the exception of The Vampires and This Day's Death, however. He then produced a documentary book. He described it as a documentary, a non-fiction book, which came out in, when did it come out? Let's see, 1977. Again from Grove in the USA. And this is the book. This is The Sexual Outlaw. And this is the Future edition from 1981 in A format. And as you can see, it's got a double male symbol there. And yes, this has seen some action. Gosh, that's really faded. And again, this was bought for me by a friend as a present, because I'm looking around for these things. And then when books are out of print, you know, you just have to hope you'd come across them. And I say, by this point, he was a cult figure in the UK. And, you know, less so in America, but not as famous as he had been. And this really is a polemical book. It's essays punctuated by a narrative, which is clearly about Rechy himself. and his adventures in the sexual underworld. And at this point, the Donuts riot had happened in 1959. Stonewall had sort of come along. Gay rights was becoming more and more of a thing, and Rechy was a proselytizer for that as he got more and more involved with that world. And this is a book about promiscuity, and there's no euphemisms in this. It's very, very direct. It's very, very sexual all the way through. If you're easily shocked, you shouldn't pick it up. It is full of very blatant descriptions of all kinds of sexual acts between men. And really, I guess the equivalent in science fiction would be Samuel R. Delany's works, his more non-SF works that go in that area. And Rechy and Delany are interesting characters to compare in that respect. But it's an enormously brave book that holds nothing back, and it will make your jaw drop, and it really shocked and surprised me at the time. It also prepared me for reading Foucault and reading about Foucault, who of course, the French intellectual, who of course was gay and who was involved in S&M, and there's some S&M stuff in there. So when you read this book, as I say, 1979, you begin to understand how the promiscuity amongst the gay underworlds of major cities worldwide led to the very swift spread of AIDS and HIV, how that happened and what a tragedy that was. But you read this and you understand that was kind of inevitable. I'm not making a moral judgment here. I'm making a scientific judgment about frequency and the way that promiscuity was such a really big thing in the gay world. But it is uncompromising. You see people pursuing their destinies and pursuing their desires without any restraint at all, and maybe that's the problem. But of course, what came then in the next few years with HIV and AIDS had a devastating impact. Rechy himself lost lots of friends. He was very lucky, he was fine. And you know, it really is quite something. A lot of these books are hard to find. I'm not sure if they're in print in the States. They do get reprinted in the States now and again. I haven't checked it out, so you might want to look for yourselves. But then probably the finest book he produced at the end of the 70s. I say 79, this was actually 77 now I think about it. In 79 he produced this book, which again I regard as an absolute masterpiece, alongside City of Night and Fourth Angel, and this is Rush's. And again, I bought this, I think, from Compendium in London. I'm pretty sure I got it there, mid-80s. And this is a Black Cat Grove Press A format edition. There was also a play version of this that he wrote called Tigers Wild, which is a quotation from William Blake. And Rush's is an absolutely fantastic novel. I don't care who you are or what you like, but this is one of the really, really finest character studies set around one milieu. It's set in one evening, and it happens in a gay bar in Los Angeles, which I think is done by a port side called Rush's. And it has four main characters who represent different archetypes from that underground world of homosexuality. There's Endor, who is sophisticated, handsome, 30-ish, successful novelist, and he is kind of an analogue for Rechy himself, and a man of great taste and sophistication and wit and humanity. Then there's a young guy who's quite attractive, dresses a bit like a cowboy. I can't recall his name. And let's see, what is his name? Bill? Yeah, Billy. And he is sort of, he isn't exactly butch and he isn't exactly femme. He's sort of halfway between the two, but he's a good looking young guy. And there's also Chaz, who is a 27-year-old top man. He's into leather, he's into sadomasochism, he's a master, not a slave, and he is very evangelical about this. And there's an older guy who's never been attractive. He comes from a previous generation, called Don, and Don is the sort of person who makes a good friend to other homosexuals but never gets a lot of love or attention himself. And these characters spend their evening at the bar together, talking about various things, about people they know, about their sexuality, their different theories. And there's a certain amount of needle, particularly between Endo and Chaz. And also Don is feeling very neglected as he's getting older and becoming even less attractive than he was. And he will gradually be forced out of the bar because at a certain point, they don't let anybody in of a certain age who's above a certain age. And then a young man comes in, and it's his first sort of time in a gay bar. And if you know the song, YMCA by the Village People, young man, and that's where that comes from. The term young man, the two words run together, comes from John Rechy, comes from City of Night, and is used on and off throughout these books. So It's an amazing, compassionate, in-your-face read, and I can't recommend it enough. I absolutely love this book. This is probably my favourite book by him after Fourth Angel, and it really, really does take you beneath the skin of these characters. These are not just men who are there because of sex, and that is such a big feature through all of Rechy's books. They're there for all sorts of reasons, and it's really, really powerful and beautiful. And as a play, it must have been fantastic to see Rechy's classic work of the counterculture. Rechy then started to sort of go off the boil for me, and in 1983 he produced a book for Carroll and Graf, and I've never seen the Carroll and Graf edition. This is the UK edition. This is the UK first edition of Bodies and Souls, W.H. Allen, which is a paperback from Star, and as you see they've gone for the same sort of cover as the Granada City of Night. And Bodies and Souls, I used to have the paperback. I got rid of it a long time ago because I picked this up, and this cost me £2.50. I think it was in Hay on Wye. And Bodies and Souls is rather like The Vampires. There's a big cast of characters, but they don't seem to be related. I'm just going to read you a little snippet, and it's a big chunky tome, as you can see. Notice how the text block has toned over the years. Set in Los Angeles, diverse cast includes the most famous actress in pornographic films, a Chicano teenager who wanders into the punk world, a male stripper who finds himself during a make-believe slave auction, a Mr. Universe contender who discovered what his physical perfection conceals, scheming promiscuous female television news reporter, a powerful evangelist whose gothic background suggests incest and suicide, and there's other characters who wander through it: Oren, Lisa, and one called Jesse James. And you wonder, how are these people all connected in the Los Angeles of the early 80s? And there's a wonderful climax that pulls them all together, which will remind some people of a J.G. Ballard novel, and it all comes together. And you think he's done this thing where there just seem to be all these vignettes and these stories. I mean, what ties these characters together? It's a portrait of the city and its underbelly. And in that way, it's absolutely marvellous. But it does feel a little bit more sensationalistic than a lot of the early works. But it's still a great work. And that, for me, sort of put a line under Rechy. He produced other work after that. He did a book called Marilyn's Daughter, which I don't have anymore, a big chunky book about a young girl who discovers she's the daughter of Marilyn Monroe. And it's quite gosh wow. And there's also a marvellous book, which I wish I still had, called The Miraculous Day of Amalia Gomez, which came out in the late 80s. And that's set in one of the ghettos in LA, Chicano ghettos, and it's about a very loving mother whose children get involved with gangs and stuff, and it's very, very tragic. And it's one of the sort of key books of the Chicano really revolution in writing. You know, if you look at Chicano literature, it's a really, really important book, but I don't have it anymore, and I wish I still had it. I think it's probably still in print in the States. He went on then and he wrote several other books, and I'm actually going to look at Wikipedia here because a lot of the later ones I'm not so familiar with. There's Our Lady of Babylon, Arcade 1996, which might have genre content. Then he was a return to form with a wonderful book called The Coming of the Night from Grove Press, again in 1999. A bit of an on and off situation with Grove and Rechy, and that was a return to form. It reminded me a lot of Rechy's, and I do have a copy of somewhere, but I can't find it. I'll stick a picture up on the screen. And The Coming of the Night shows a young man coming out for the first time and going to a gay nightclub and becoming part of the scene and becoming accepted. And it's a really amazing book, but it's got all sorts of things in there about HIV and AIDS and queer bashing and all that sort of stuff. But it's a really marvellous book. That was a real return to form for him. The later books I never really liked the look of. There was one called Beneath the Skin, which was non-fiction, which didn't do a lot for me. But I really guess I should go back to Rechy and look at the ones I haven't read. But in his time, he was a most amazing counterculture writer. And, you know, you do have to be able to put yourself outside of your normal sort of reading thing. For most people who will be heterosexual, they may find it a bit uncomfortable. You know, we live in different times now where, you know, every sort of novel published has to have a diverse or sexually diverse range of characters. But this is from a time when homosexual writers had to be brave. There really was something to kick against. They weren't accepted. The people weren't accepted. The writers weren't accepted. And there were terrible miscarriages of justice. People were subject to violence and all kinds of persecution. It's a different world, and Rechy writes from that world, and he's rebellious and loud and mouthy, but at the same time very heartfelt, and at his best, absolutely beautiful writing. So I'd really recommend them. City of Night, as I say, is in print in the UK. Do get a copy of it. It's a really good classic counterculture novel. But later on, when he's able to be a bit more direct, I would really urge you to read Fourth Angel, one of the finest counterculture novels I've ever read, and Rushes. He's a really spectacular writer. And I've gone back to the books the last couple of days and reread bits of them. And even though they do have the flaw of being very self-centered and narcissistic, that is a theme, and it's an old theme. The theme of narcissism, of course, goes way back in the classical mythology. But for their bravery and their willingness to put what cannot be said out there and say it, they really are quite spectacularly good. So I hope you'll give one or two of those a try. They're great books, and anybody who is of a gay persuasion, if you haven't read them, you really are missing out. They really are key texts of gay literature, and they're also essential for anybody who wants to understand the Beat generation, the avant-garde, the counterculture as it was in the 50s, 60s and 70s and beyond. Fantastic works, John Rechy. And remember, if you're a lucky little lady in the City of Night, or you're just another lost angel, City of Night, and its numbers, of course. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.